Hello everyone, this is the Red Dose of Truth. Today we're going to go over a few things that has to do with Trump's recent pick of Doctor Judy Shelton. First and foremost, we're going to look at this article by the National Endowment for Democracy and find out just exactly who Dr. Shelton really is. Economist Judy Shelton specializes in global finance and monetary issues. She has testified before Congress as an expert witness at hearings conducted by Senate Banking, Senate Foreign Relations, House Banking, House Foreign Affairs, and the Joint Economic Committee. Dr. Shelton has been consulted on international economic and financial issues by national security officials at the White House and Pentagon. She received a postdoctoral fellowship from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University as a National Fellow. She was named as a Hoover Scholar and was subsequently appointed Senior Research Fellow between the years 1985 and 1995. Furthermore, Shelton was an economic advisor for the National Commission on Economic Growth and Tax Reform chaired by Jack Kemp, 1995 through 96. She was a founding member of the Board of Directors of Empower America and has also served on the Board of Directors for Hilton Hotels and Atlantic Coast Airlines. She has taught international finance as a visiting professor at the DUXX Graduate School of Business in Monterrey, Mexico from 1995 to 2001. Shelton joined the Atlas Network in 2010, where she serves as Senior Fellow. She has written 2 monographs for Atlas, A Guide to Sound Money in 2010 and Fixing the Dollar Now in 2011. She was a member of the Board of Directors of the National Endowment for Democracy 2005 to 2014, and she served on NED's Budget and Audit Committee and was the designated board expert on Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. She was appointed and served as vice chairman of the NED board from 2010 to 2014. She holds a PhD in business administration with an emphasis on finance and international economics from the University of Utah. Now then, let's look at why it is she was picked out her. This here is exactly the reason why Trump picked Dr. Judy Shelton to be the Federal Reserve chair. Okay? The idea is to get us off the petrodollar and back to the gold standard. And in this video, I'll go into detail for those that don't know what the petrodollar is. But first, let's go through this. The once fringe fantasy of a return to the gold standard is creeping back into the mainstream. It has long been dismissed as a fool's errand on par with abandoning the Federal Reserve and other trappings of the modern economy. Mainstream economists deride it almost without exception. Reintroducing the gold standard would be a disaster for any large advanced economy, says the University of Chicago's Anil Kashyap, who connects enthusiasm for it with macroeconomic illiteracy. His colleague, Nobel laureate Richard Thaler, struggles with its very underlying principle. Why tie to gold? Why not 1982 Bordeaux? Yet the idea that every U.S. dollar should be backed by a small amount of actual gold is more popular than economists' opinions might suggest. Advocates include members of Congress and President Donald Trump. Enthusiasm for a return to the gold standard has become more prominent since Trump's most recent nominees to fill the vacant Federal Reserve governorship have endorsed a return. The first two, Herman Cain and Stephen Moore, both dropped out of consideration, but the third, economist Judy Shelton, announced today in a Trump tweet by the most ardent in her support. Last year, Shelton called for a new Bretton Woods conference. The Bretton Woods conference is when FDR decided to back the U.S. dollar with the petrodollar. Akin to the 1944 meeting that established the post-war economic order, perhaps to be held at Mar-a-Lago, where a return to the gold standard could be considered. We make America great again by making America's money great again, she wrote in the Journal of the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank. Since 2011, at least 6 states have passed laws recognizing gold and silver as currency. Another 3 are presently contemplating bills of their own. The surprising success of Ron Paul, a Texas Republican congressman, an ardent gold bug in the 2008 and 2012 elections showed the potency of these ideas among the electorate. In its 2012 and 2016 campaign platforms, the Republican Party called for a commission to investigate the viability of a return to a gold standard system. The Republican-controlled House of Representatives passed a bill including such a commission in both 2015 and 2017, but both times the proposals died in the Senate. Last year, Alexander Mooney, a Republican representative from West Virginia, took that a step further when he introduced a bill proposing a full-on return to the gold standard. The bill has no co-sponsors and, unsurprisingly, has gone nowhere. Today, with inflation unusually low and stable, the gold standard is a tougher sell than it once was. But as trust in American institutions wanes, there is renewed support for money backed by something tangible. Not the say-so of the government. If inflation picks up once again, a solid base of gold standard evangelists is ready to take it mainstream. That a supporter of the gold standard may yet wind up on the Fed's Board of Governors is yet more evidence that the idea's prospects are shining brighter than they have in many years. Money depends on trust, the faith that it will hold its value so that when the time comes to spend it, it will be accepted without question in exchange for what the holder expects it to be worth. Inflation eats away at that value. In modern times, governments are often a culprit behind inflation. Since they enjoy a monopoly on printing money, they can issue new currency at virtually no cost. But governments are run by vote-seeking politicians who might print more money to juice short-term growth needed to win re-election, inadvertently causing inflation to flare up later. This quandary isn't theoretical and has happened with surprising frequency throughout history. To cite a recent prominent example, U.S. President Richard Nixon bent to this temptation during his 1972 re-election campaign, contributing to the breakout of inflation that ravaged the American economy throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. There's a seemingly easy fix: take the power of money creation out of the hands of politicians. According to the monetarist theory popularized by economist Milton Friedman in the 1970s, preventing inflation requires fixing the supply of money. The gold standard, by limiting the dollars the government can print to the weight of gold it holds in reserves, is one way of doing so. The U.S. adopted the gold standard in 1879 when Congress finally followed Britain, Germany, France, and other advanced nations. By holding national currency stable against gold, the international embrace of the gold standard encouraged foreign investment and facilitated trade, giving rise to the first era of intense globalization. Here's a very cartoonish version of how it worked. The U.S. Treasury agreed to redeem a set weight of gold in exchange for a fixed number of dollars, and vice versa. During the classical gold standard era from 1879 to 1914 in the U.S., 1 troy ounce of gold fetched $21. The gold standard's discipline came from the fact that the government had to be sure it held the necessary volume of gold in reserve, in case anyone wanted to exchange dollars for a set amount of the shiny metal. If it printed more money than it held in gold reserves, the state risked hyperinflation or causing a financial crisis by shattering faith in the solidity of its currency. In theory, the gold standard therefore limits government spending to only what it can raise in taxes or borrow against its gold reserve, and prevents it from simply printing money to pay its debts. It also takes power over the money supply away from central bankers. Indeed, it might render central banks mostly unnecessary. Bear in mind that for most of the classical gold standard era, the U.S. didn't have a central bank, which was introduced in 1913. Had history worked out differently, the dollar might have been pegged to cowrie shells, peppercorns, or giant stone discs, all of which, like gold, have served as money at one time or another. But for reasons both aesthetic and practical, the glimmering metal became the asset of choice. The simple answer to that is that for the last 5,000 years, so far as we are aware, man has used gold and silver as money, and particularly gold, says Alasdair MacLeod, the head of research at Gold Money, a Toronto-based investment manager for precious metals. It's durable, people respect that it's got value, it's actually as simple as that. It is something which markets should be free to choose, and they have chosen gold. Gold is integral to the story of U.S. growth and prosperity. In the 19th century, discoveries of subterranean veins in at least 24 states were rungs in a ladder that culminated in America's economic domination of the globe, prompting westward migration and economic expansion, writes James Ledbetter in One Nation Under Gold, how one precious metal has dominated the American imagination for 4 centuries. It is a national emblem of wealth, and streets paved with gold served as a myth that helped lure many migrants to the U.S. From the very beginnings of our national life, it has seemed impossible for Americans to look at gold dispassionately, Ledbetter explains. The metal and its seductive hint of boundless wealth tap into a psychological wellspring that reaches beyond any purely physical qualities. Legislation in the past century, which codified and restricted how Americans could attain or trade gold, seems to have intensified the longing for it. In 1933, Americans were temporarily barred from buying and selling gold within the country. By the 1950s, the law was still in place and a black market for gold flourished. John F. Kennedy was anxious that the dollar should be as good as gold. Operation Goldfinger, which launched a few years later, was a top-secret government campaign to dig up gold within U.S. territories as quickly as possible, with the hope of propping up a post-war economy expanding at a pace that threatened to outstrip the world's supply of the metal. The gold standard is inextricably tied to mining. The supply of the metal depends on how much is extracted from the earth, after all. But since mining only adds a tiny fraction to the overall stock of gold each year, prices don't fluctuate as wildly as they used to. In the height of mining activity in the mid-1800s, big gold discoveries in California and Australia spurred a pickup in inflation. Then, as economic growth outpaced the rate of new gold discoveries, a 20-year period of deflation set in. It ended with new discoveries in South Africa and the Yukon, as well as technological advances in gold processing. That's how things are supposed to work. When a gold shortage causes purchasing power to rise steadily, mining companies are encouraged to find more gold. And indeed, overall prices and real economic activity during the classical gold standard era was remarkably stable. If you look at the U.S. during its classical gold standard period, the average rate of inflation is pretty close to zero. And likewise in Great Britain, over its experience with the gold standard, says Lawrence White, an economics professor at George Mason University and one of the few respected economists who's pro-gold standard. Gold standard adherents often extol the strength of currencies such as the pound and the dollar in the early 20th century. Modern central banking, they say, has knocked the stuffing out of these once mighty currencies. The fact that average hourly wages have mostly been adjusted to match the rise in inflation doesn't seem to factor into the equation. Where mainstream economists see constraint, gold bugs see discipline, a government that cannot spend beyond its means, and a hedge against corruption. For those who believe in small, limited government, there is obvious appeal. Believers credit it with a kind of Midas touch. The gold standard necessarily begets balanced budgets, low taxes, small government, and a healthy economy. To borrow the words of economist Barry Eichengreen, a prominent historian of currencies at the University of California, Berkeley. The thing is, economic success during the classical gold standard era depends somewhat on the eye of the beholder. David Laidler, a monetary historian at Western University in Ontario and Friedman's research assistant in the 1960s, says the gold standard wasn't as effortlessly successful as the data might suggest. I don't see any real reason to continue going through this whole article. Basically, it's this, that most of us believe in small government. We want our government to be reined in, their spending, the amount of national debt that we have. We know good and well that the government's out of control and has been for a long time. Historically, regardless of what the naysayers might say, having our currency backed by gold ensured all of the things exactly what we're talking about right now. The things that we want. The things that we're hoping for. And so it's my opinion that one of the best choices President Trump could have made for the Federal Reserve chair is certainly Judy Shelton. And I think that the future, whether it be in the next year and a half or when the president's reelected in 2020, I think you'll see the push to go to a gold-backed standard happen rather quickly. Again, that part is pure speculation, but having somebody on the Federal Reserve chair who is a proponent of backing our currency by the gold standard is certainly a plus. I hope you all have a great day. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Share it with your friends. It certainly helps get the word out. Thanks.